Good afternoon and welcome to this RTPI online events 2021 series brought to you along with the RTPI Yorkshire. Today's webinar is about the changing approaches to flood management and the implications for planning. Just a quick few points before we start. There'll be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. To submit your questions, if you could put it in the questions box that's on, it should be on the right hand side on the webinar. Send them at any point during the webinar because I can pick them up to then ask Liz at the end. After the webinar, you'll have a survey and we'd be really appreciative if you could fill that in and return it to us. There's also an upcoming list of RTPI Yorkshire events that can be found on our events webs page, and there's also details in the chat function. That leads me to introduce Liz Sharp. She is a senior lecturer at Sheffield University. She has worked at Sheffield University, at Bradford University, where she taught me and my husband. I'd just like to put in there quite a while ago. But she focuses on, I'm just reading this because I don't know this off the top of my head, unfortunately. Liz has a degree in geography and worked as an environmental consultant before undertaking an MA and a PhD in the planning department at the University of Sheffield. She focused on engagement in local environment policy making, and this is a theme which has remained central to her research since. She worked for 15 years at the Department of Environmental Science in the University of Bradford before returning to Sheffield University 6 years ago. And with no further ado, there you go, Liz. I will let you take over and I'll be back at the agreed point. Thank you very much.
Becky. Okay, so as Becky said, I'm going to talk a bit about changing approaches to flood risk management and the implications for planning. I must admit I'm not completely up on the latest information about what planning is doing about X or Y. I'm more looking to highlight what I know about the changing nature of flood risk management and hoping to stimulate a conversation with you about what that means for planning. Okay, so as Becky said, my background really focuses on public participation in environmental policy. In the past, I looked at waste, but for the last kind of 20 years or so, I've been looking at water. And my current work is working with the Living with Water Partnership in Hull and East Riding, focusing on how garden and community water butts or rain gardens can contribute to addressing the really severe flood risk management issues they've got in that area. One of the things is I'm kind of trying to use action research, so working with people and working closely across disciplines with engineers and community development people and people in the community themselves. So today then, the key argument I'm going to make is that flood risk management has become increasingly entangled with other sectors, including planning. Which seek to influence the form and function of the landscape. And that really fundamentally changes its role. And in a sense, we've got a whole lot of legacy institutions and rules and systems that need to be shifted, I think, in planning as well as other sectors. So I'm going to talk firstly about what is flooding and how should it and why should it be managed. Secondly, how should it be managed and what are these changing approaches? And thirdly, sort of reflections on the implications. And I'm aiming to take about 20 minutes, a little bit more. Becky will be coming back at 20 minutes. So what is flooding and why should it be managed? So the European Flood Directive says flood is just a temporary covering of land by water. But really, you know, somewhere up in, this was the Welsh Highlands shown somewhere up above Brecon in this photograph. You know, really, this may be a temporary covering of land by water, but I don't think anybody cares. So technically, this may be a flood, but really what matters is flood risk, which is both the probability of a flood event, so the chance it could happen, and crucially, the potential adverse consequences for human health, the environment, cultural heritage, and economic activity. So basically, flooding is a problem if it disturbs something we value: homes, nature, agriculture, industry. And it is a huge problem, actually. So flooding can risk human life, particularly where critical infrastructure is threatened. So if people are without water supply or electricity supply, they're cut off in their properties. It's also even more minor levels, such as that illustrated in this photograph, are extremely distressing. The physical recovery of buildings can take years because of the extent of redecoration and structural fixing required, and causes obviously huge disruption to life. Those who have been flooded talk about the ongoing mental distress. Every time it rains, I get worried and I have to go home or something like that. You know, people find once they've been flooded, they are worried about the fear of being flooded again. And there's also an issue of economic livelihoods if your workplace is flooded, or agricultural losses. So there are a number of reasons we need to be very concerned about flooding. In addition to all of that, the areas with the greatest probability of flooding are often those in which the most economically deprived live, and therefore they often have other aspects of vulnerability. So you kind of have intersectional vulnerability. So you have people who have chaotic lives or limited funds and don't have the same ability, for example, to go and stay with friends if their house is threatened by flooding, as some other people have. So we need to be particularly careful where that's the case. And then there's a significant challenge about property blight, that, you know, if you have paid all your life savings to buy a house and then it gets flooded and gets known as a flood region and the price goes down, you can really suffer. So there are very significant human costs of flooding. So we need to manage it because of these human costs of flooding. We also can manage it to some extent anyway. So there is a real sort of question in how we talk about flooding, and it rocks around between being seen as a sort of natural thing, a natural disaster, versus being a man-made or human-created disaster. And, you know, on the sort of argument for it being natural, of course, rainfall, rivers levels and tides have always varied and always will vary. Inevitably, some are going to be higher than others, and that will lead to places being temporarily covered by water that are not usually. So that technically that will lead to floods. So there is certainly a natural aspect to it. However, there's also a very significant human aspect. Human activity upstream from a flooded location or further along a coast from a coastal location contributes to the probability of flooding. If you protect one place through flood defences, you kind of push the flood along or down to somewhere else. More generally, urbanisation and intensive farming practices tend to speed up the flows of water. So what might have previously infiltrated into soil runs along a road or along a pipe and leads to a much more flashy flood. Like, so all the water comes quickly and arrives in the river at the same time, causing a much bigger flood peak. And likewise, processes of cultivation as opposed to natural vegetation can be lead to much more rapid flooding, particularly if you have an area which is drained. And then added to all of that, climate change is going to make, or is already making, rainfall more extreme, also making drought more extreme, both of which contribute to faster flows during flooding. So there is a real issue with climate change making flood risks significantly worse and needing us to adapt. So that's kind of the background. So how should we manage flooding? And I'm going to talk through 3 changing approaches. So a sort of ancient, if you want, approach, living with flooding, an approach that then became more common in the 19th and 20th century, which is flood defence, and then the more recent approaches, which are called both flood risk management and flood resilience. Some subtle differences between the two, but really they come together. And this can be seen as kind of the emerging language for this century. So living with flooding or avoiding floods is the traditional perspective. So this might see flooding as an act of God and unavoidable. It will happen. And therefore we need to avoid being vulnerable to it. And we do that through carefully setting our settlements above the area that's liable to flooding. And the picture shows the cathedral, Ely Cathedral, which was built on an island raised above the surrounding very flat floodlands. Also moving livestock according to the season. So for example, the word or the county name Somerset comes from summer people, as in the land which is occupied in the summer when it's dry, as opposed to the winter when it's wet and flooded. And we also have a long tradition from Yorkshire of roads on hillsides and on the highland avoiding river crossings and bogs, which are liable to be more impacted by flooding. So just by way of example, the route between Settle and Landcliffe in North Yorkshire, you can see the green line shows the old pack horse route, which is at the top of the hill. There was also a road for carts, which is shown in red, and the modern road, which is yellow, which sort of very close to the river and much more liable to flooding. But nowadays we can build roads in ways with bridges and whatever that sort of avoid the flooding largely. However, if there's a really bad flood, we won't necessarily. But you can bet your bottom dollar that you could still take the pack horse route to Landcliffe if you wanted to, even if the other two were obscured by flooding. So traditional routes were avoiding the flood. So moving on then to sort of the 19th century approach and the 20th century approach. So flood defence basically sought to protect ourselves from flooding through developing particular locations that would be flood-free. So for example, the use of sea walls to protect from high tides, levees and reinforced riverbanks, such as that shown in the photograph, to protect from river flooding, canalisation, you could say that's also shown in the photograph, and culverting, which is the covering of channels of streams and rivers in urban areas. And many of our urban areas, for example, Bradford and Sheffield that we were talking about earlier, have major becks or rivers going through their city centres, which are in culverts, so underneath the ground and hidden from view. And both are subject to some current plans for deculverting, for re-daylighting those rivers. And then field drains and pumping from wetlands to enable crop growth, for example, in East Anglia in the Netherlands, and in Yorkshire, we can think about field drains at high levels. So flood defence came into criticism at the end of the 20th century. There was this recognition that by holding back nature, that flood defence is moving floods but not preventing them. I'll just say, yeah, the Thames Barrier you can see in this photograph is another example, a more modern example, if you want, of flood defence, which is seeking to hold back the tide. These structures tend to be very expensive to build and quite expensive to maintain. So we know, for example, the Thames Barrier was very expensive to build, but it won't be enough, and we're going to have to build more if we want to protect London from flooding. And likewise, all around the country, we're facing very severe challenges of building and maintaining flood defences. There's also an issue that flood defences disrupt nature and do great ecological harm. So by stopping the natural flows of flooding floodplains and things like that, you're stopping nutrients entering the soil, you're by canalising rivers, you're scouring the beds and meaning they don't have the quality of variety that would allow fish to spawn. So there's a real concern that we've killed off a lot of our aquatic life through not through necessarily just the chemicals and contents we put in our rivers, but through the physical changes to them. And then the whole process, in a sense, has it still has a sort of control idea. There's a lack of recognition about the human causes of flooding and the role of land use in contributing to that. So that's what we'll see starts to be addressed through flood risk management that I'll be talking about next. But just before I move to that, one of the other approaches of flood defence is to sort of pigeonhole flooding into different forms of flooding. So this is a diagram from Southern Water that tries to highlight all the different forms of flooding you can have. So surface water flooding, private drainage flooding, and so on. And I've made a sort of short list, not all of them, but short list of them on the right there. And you don't necessarily need to understand all the differences between those. But I think the key point to make here was a couple of points. Firstly, that there are some very high profile types of flooding, so coastal, fluvial, which is another word for river, and reservoir flooding are things we hear about in the news. They're often very large scale when they occur. They occur infrequently, but obviously they have big consequences or big risks attached to them, which is why they're highlighted in the news. But there is a lot of other flooding that you don't hear so much about. And this is primarily surface water, sewer, or groundwater flooding, which generally, not always, occur through smaller scale events, which happen more frequently, often to the same people over and over again, and seldom make the news, but can cause great misery. So I guess I just wanted to kind of flag up that other form of flooding. Now, the key point about these different forms of flooding that fits in with flood defence really is, well, firstly, that in all cases, really the property owner and residents have to deal with the flood. They have to organise their recovery, they may have private insurance, but it's up in the UK, it's up to the individual. If you're flooded, that's your bad luck or bad judgment and your fault. But that said, there is some recognition of some broader authorities that have some responsibility for strategically managing things to minimise the extent of flooding. And the key point about all these different types of flooding is that it's a different agency in each case. If you've got pluvial flooding, it's the riparian owners, the people who live on each side of a river, and the local authority. If it's sewer flooding, it's the sewage company. If it's river flooding, it's the Environment Agency, or it might be the local authority, depending on the designation of the river, and so on. Now, I mean, I don't know about you, but most people who are flooded have no idea where the water came from. And when they're faced with a website, as they frequently are, which says, work out what sort of flooding before you decide who to ring, it's very annoying, because life is hard enough being flooded in the first place, let alone being left with, who do I ring? And the sort of the flood defence approach, which was we can control flooding and these different organisations are in control, it's kind of part of that myth of control. And the other thing I wanted to say here is that actually there's an awful lot of floods that involve a mixture of these different forms of flooding. So this idea of there being a single source of flooding is actually to a very large extent rubbish. You know, with one flood, you might be able to work out what sort of flooding it is, but with other floods, it's a mixture, it's a combination, and you can't separate it out and say this organisation is responsible and that one is not. So, in response to all those critiques of flood defence, then, from the early 20th or the late very end of the 20th century and beginning of this century, we began to talk about flood risk management that seeks not just to protect us from flooding, but also to prevent flooding. And it aims to do this through making space for water, but seeking to make space for water in locations where the harm to human activity is minimised. So, for example, recreating upland bogs through natural flood risk management, for example, investment in leaky dams, so in the upland locations such as that shown in the photograph. Investment in sustainable drainage features, sometimes called water-sensitive urban design, which help infiltrate water locally rather than take it directly into a drain, frequently found in urban areas, but not necessarily. And then third bullet, making room for the river, identifying and protecting floodplain locations, washlands, and also freshwater or salt marsh space on the coast. I mean, a very small example of making room for the river can be seen in the Pocket Park, shown in the photograph on the right. This is a location from Sheffield, where they've excavated a little bit of land on a very, very flashy, canalised river called the River Sheaf, just to try and make a bit more space to stop flooding downstream. I mean, it also creates a nice landscape feature. And then alongside flood risk management, and it's perhaps slightly more recent, so flood risk management was really championed in government documents from 2004, 2005 onwards, whereas flood resilience has really become central to government discourse since 2020 and is very important in the way we talk about things now. And this approach recognises that we cannot stop all floods, and we cannot prevent all floods, and therefore we need to be prepared through aware and alert householders, particularly those in flood vulnerable zones, protect the vulnerable homes through flood resilient building techniques, effective prediction and warning systems, well-developed emergency services, and support processes for post-flood recovery. And so you can see the 2020 strategy on the right, which champions this approach. You can also see an example of the sort of floodgates that people might be encouraged to fit to protect their homes, and a flood warning system from sometime earlier this year when there were quite a lot of flood warnings, or last year. This might have been November. Yeah, obviously there are times when there are a lot of risks, and you can sign up if you live in a flood risk area to get a warning, as long as you're at the risk of river flooding. If you're at the risk of surface water flooding, no warnings are to be had. Okay, so moving on then to what are the implications of these changing approaches. So firstly, for the flood risk manager, now so I guess this is where a lot of my research is focusing. In the past, they've been very much technical experts. They tend to have been trained in engineering. They calculate flood risk and they do appropriate modelling and designs, and they also support the emergency planning process. So that's been the sort of approach under a flood defence perspective. Under flood risk management and flood resilience, there's a real shift here. Rather than somebody who's, you know, happiest with their calculator, the flood risk manager of today needs to be a much more personable, political, diplomatic communicator. Firstly, they need to work with other professionals to negotiate about finding space for water on the surface in all sorts of different locations, both the upland agricultural locations and all sorts of locations through cities and indeed in the floodplain. They must communicate with the public about storing water on their streets and gardens, potentially losing or giving up to multifunctionality, parking spaces, football pitches, parks, gardens. And there's a lot of things we could ask for, which in a sense they have no power to ask for. They don't own this land. It's a tricky ask, which needs to come perhaps with investment. And we can see some of that investment coming from water companies, some from local authorities, but really whether there's enough investment as we need for really adapting our landscapes for climate change is highly questionable. And then finally, I would say ongoing support for emergency services and indeed recovery services, which I think are recognised as increasingly important, linking closely with those issues of vulnerability I talked about earlier. And then, well, moving more towards what it might mean for planners, thinking about the implications for landscape management. So in the uplands, we might be talking about controlled planting and drainage to hold back the water via, for example, tree planting or the recreation of upland bogs. In an urban area, building sustainable drainage. Here I actually do have a picture of sustainable drainage in that middle photograph. Into old properties and new properties, but also retrofitting into parks and streets. So that photograph comes from a part of the Greater Green project in Sheffield that some of you might have heard of. And in general, making space for water whenever possible. And again, you know, there are some very useful things that might come alongside that. So if you're putting more green space in a street, you're probably contributing to public health. You might be contributing to making the neighbourhood more suitable for active travel, but you're also likely to be taking away from space for cars. And obviously, as planners, we know there's an awful lot of controversy there about the different ways that city centre or any urban space is used. And then in the floodplain, there's a real need to maintain and develop new washlands. Obviously, there's intense ongoing disputes about building new homes. I mean, can we stop building in the floodplain? We've been told that planners should not build in the floodplain since I studied planning in the 1990s, but we are continuing to build in the floodplain. The hope has to be that properties can be built in a way which is flood resilient, and that we have excellent warning systems. There are some real challenges there, because if the public are aware that properties are in a floodplain, and for example, through flood resilient features, they may be put off buying it, whereas a more vulnerable property that doesn't actually show that it's flood resilient may be more attractive because it doesn't tell you it's in a floodplain. Ultimately then we're left with a bit of a dilemma in a way. One perspective, probably the one I favour, is that this move towards flood risk management and flood resilience is really good. Certainly, I think it's useful to move beyond the technical illusion that we can control flooding, to recognise it's a socio-technical system, there are human influences on it, and that we need to kind of take some responsibility for trying to influence those. But through doing that, it's trying to spread the responsibility beyond the flood risk managers to many different professionals. And there's a limit to what anyone can do, and that's a challenge. It does explicitly acknowledge that there are vulnerable people and we need to pay attention to the vulnerable people. And there is potential to use flood investment to help address other issues such as health inequalities. So those are really good features. However, there are also things that we need to watch out for and be careful about. So I would ask whether agricultural funders, planners, landscape designers, are they really in a position to support the changes that are needed? And is the joined up funding there to do that? And then where's the joined up communications linking flood risk management and drought management and adaptation to climate change? Because it's almost a big conversation we need to have with the public about these things, which I don't see happening at all. And, you know, okay, yes, it's great if we can support the public in getting prepared for flooding, but if we then start to blame them for not being prepared, are we just dumping all the responsibility on them? So there are some real sort of risks with this approach. So just as a sort of endpoint, really, some questions for you. As I say, I'm not an expert really in the current context of planners. So I'm interested from you about the extent to which you feel funded and empowered to understand and act on flood risk and resilience. You know, what are you able to do and deliver now on the positive side, but on the more questionable side, what aspects of legislation, funding and communications are needed to enhance your effectiveness in addressing the very real flood risk we face? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting. So if anybody has any questions, if you could send them through on the questions section for me, please, and I can start picking them up. We do have some already. So the first one comes from Louise Reiki. I hope I pronounced that right. And she says, could we do more in giving grants to retrofit existing homes with suitable interiors, for example, plug sockets at waist height, removing carpets, etc.?
Yes, is the brief answer to that. I mean, it's a difficult one because the government would argue you don't expect us to make your house, you know, invulnerable to fire. We expect you to do that for yourself. Why should we have to help you make your house invulnerable to flooding? You should do that yourself. That's the kind of government line, that you should fit property level resilience yourself. But at the moment, I don't think there's much knowledge of how to do that. And in flood vulnerable zones, I think we could really do with sort of community-led campaigns about, look, we're in a flood area here, let's all work together to perhaps have some recognised contractors who have been trusted by the local authority or something, who can come in and help do up your home at maybe at cost price, or, you know, something that limited the cost or to some extent subsidised it, but was looking for a contribution from homeowners, maybe depending on income or something like that. I think we definitely could do more. I do appreciate that the government don't want to just make it a free-for-all. But yeah, there is definitely a question to be explored there.
Okay, thank you. I think one from me now, because obviously I work in York, which is, well, I don't think I really need to say much more than that. We have a great relationship with the Environment Agency, and we're currently working, well, they're currently working, we're working with them on a number of schemes to try and alleviate flooding. And that's something that it's a really good working relationship, but I'd be interested to know how any experience of you have with others. And obviously everybody knows that York floods, it's other, and we have that, not advantage at all, but we do have that good working relationships. What other experience do you have with the Environment Agency or others? And as planners, how can we help more, is my question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the partnership between different professionals is really central to making the whole flood risk management thing work. You know, and a real problem in the past is that the way legislation bundled up responsibility is that it set planners, water companies, and the Environment Agency, or local authorities, water companies and the Environment Agency against each other, kind of blaming each other for the flood. And obviously that just made everybody look ridiculous. I mean, my experience is that there are many places where there are fantastic working relationships often with the people who are flood risk managers for the area as the sort of, so the local authorities, where they're the lead local flood authority, such as York is, then they tend to be the sort of linchpin between the relationships with the Environment Agency on the one hand and the water company on the other. So in the case of York, for example, Steve Ragg, who you probably know, Becky,
I do indeed.
who you know, who works very closely with the other authorities, and I think brings the planners into that discussion. And like, you know, because for a lot of planners, you know, my experience of planning education in the past has been one hasn't learned much about flooding. So a lot of planners don't know that much about flooding. I mean, maybe you lot, a new generation, do know more. And you've needed that flood expertise within local authorities to sort of get up to speed with it, and to help support that relationship with the other water professionals, and indeed to sort of say, well, this is our responsibility, this is theirs. And obviously, you know, there's a lot of working on what can we do with developers, what can we get into our local plan, you know, and I know the rules are very limited on that. What can we persuade people to do, even if they're not in the local plan, you know, through supplementary planning guidance, or, you know, there's a whole pile of complex things to interact with and to do. I mean, there are also some poor relationships, often coming from historic blame cultures, or really where there just hasn't been a flood problem for a while, and then suddenly there is a flood, and then everybody's feeling insecure. So, but you know, I think places such as Hebden Bridge and Calderdale, such as York, such as Hull and Lees Riding, where I'm working, there tend to be quite good relationships because the problems have been so severe they really had to work them through. But could I sort of throw open to people, maybe you can put stuff in the chat about your own experiences, because I'm really interested in the variety of experiences you have of you know, what the questions I've put up here really. What are you able to do and deliver? What are the limitations on that? What could you do with being changed? Because in a sense, at the moment, the research I'm doing has the chance to take messages to DEFRA and to some of the you know, Ofwat, the funding for the water companies, to sort of say, look, we need changes in this way to help people work together better. And I think the more we can draw on your real experiences, the better.
Great. Okay, well, I've just had another really interesting question actually in the chat. This is from Toby Forbes Turner, and it says, how do we balance the need to find sites and land to build the 100,000 new homes from central government against the fact that in a lot of areas, particularly city centre brownfield sites, these are often located in area at risk of flooding? Very good point there.
Yeah, no, that's a kind of perennial, very difficult question. And there isn't an easy answer, Toby. There are some options to think about. So one would be, which is unlikely to be affordable, is floating homes, or some really creative ways of managing that the Netherlands have been exploring. But my understanding about that is that on the whole, floating homes tend to be very, very expensive because they need all sorts of very clever floating services as well. So kind of the cheaper version of that is probably to look at constructing homes in ways which are flood resilient. So that might be, for example, ensuring that ground floors are things like kind of garages and utility rooms built with perhaps bare walls and no plaster, and concrete floors, which can enable really quick recovery. Obviously, you know, you still need to think about the resilience of the electricity and stuff like that, and you still need to think about access. People still need to be able to get in and out of their homes. But it depends partly what sort of flood you're expecting, whether it's going to be something where the water is likely to hang around for an extended length of time, or whether it's likely to be more sort of flashy type of flood. But that certainly, looking at building resilience into the homes is a very important thing to consider, because really when you're dealing with a floodplain location, you know, you can't prevent completely a risk of flooding. I mean, I guess the other thing you might look at doing is, okay, is there some other brownfield location, perhaps less well located, that can be created as a washland or turned into a wetland? So can you look for other places to put the water, which might help save the location you're building the homes, and build flood defences around the homes? One of the things to bear in mind in those sorts of situations is planning for climate change to get worse. So you might say, okay, well, at the moment we need to build a bund of X height, or a flood wall, or a river levee of X height, but we also need to have the sort of levee which could be made higher. So there needs to be enough land take so it could be made higher if we're seeing higher flood levels in the future. So you kind of need to build a certain level of flexibility and resilience into your planning, rather than thinking that you can plan now for the perhaps entire lifetime of those houses. You kind of need to build in the no regrets option, even if it's slightly more expensive. So Toby, I don't know if that feels it answers the question.
I'm sure it does. That was very very comprehensive. So we have a couple more questions. So if anybody else has some, please send them through. The next one was, how do we manage underground and sewer, I think sewer flooding in newly developed residential areas?
No, so I haven't talked that much about sort of underground and sewer flooding, but it is a very severe issue, not least because if you are flooded by sewer water or by dilute sewer water, it's just extremely unpleasant, and, you know, horrible to think about even. So the reason that we have sewer flooding in the UK, or a lot of sewer flooding, is because we have a lot of combined drainage systems where we have a old Victorian sewer quite often, which takes all of the foul waste, and it also takes the waste from from rain, the highway drainage and things like that, or from your roof. With new developments, usually we separate those out, so we have separate sewer systems, but then they go into the main road where there's a combined sewer system, so they both go into the main road. And we're a long way off at the moment, having like completely separate sewer systems. So that fact that we've got combined sewer systems means that if it rains heavily, depends partly on the area or whatever, but there is a risk of sewer flooding when it rains heavily. And one of the best ways of addressing that will be to do more to try to take rainwater out of sewers. For example, through having separate systems, but separate systems that might actually go to treatment. So if you had your road water and roof water sewer going into some sort of separate treatment thing and then into the river, rather than mixing, but that depends on having space to do that separate treatment. I guess sustainable drainage of all sorts is really crucial in addressing this. So yeah, the best thought of sustainable drainage would be trying to keep more of the water where it rains. So all of us could do this through having a water butt in our garden, particularly a leaky water butt with a slow escape drain, which means that there's always space there to take more rain when it comes. Perhaps through having a pond or rain garden or something in our garden where again we have the water levels rising when there's a lot of water in the ground. That's sort of making a personal contribution. Likewise, putting sustainable drainage, for example, the what you can see in the photograph on that final slide, which is basically a sort of basically a rocky type of medium. You've got nice plants growing there, but it's not hugely soily, and that means there's a lot of voids, so there's a lot of space to store the water. And then you can see that white strip halfway through the diagram or the photograph, and basically the bed that's closest to us is slightly lower than the other one. And the idea is that that white strip, which is concrete, holds the water in the upper cell back until it reaches a certain level, and there's a little diagonal, you can't quite see it, but just behind those flowers, where when it gets full, the water flows through to the cell which is closest to us, and you can see that metal thing in the cell which is closest to us, which again, when the cell is full, the water overflows into that drain that you can see where the metal thing is, and down into a drain. But the idea is that you're holding the water back in the urban area, stopping it going into the combined sewer, stopping the combined sewer overflowing. So the best thing we can do to stop, actually not just stop sewer flooding, but also to stop a lot of the combined sewer overflows, which are causing pollution issues in our urban rivers, is to do a lot more to hold water back in the landscape. And I think over the next 10 years, you're going to hear a lot more about that.
Okay. Well, that leads us seamlessly into the next question, and it's from Kim Harding. It said, those flooding in Somerset were intent on dredging being the answer. I assume it isn't, but why? Okay,
really good question as well. So dredging is a little bit like flood defence. It provides something of an immediate answer because it kind of clears the river from silt and allows the river to flow faster at the time it's been dredged. But silting up is a natural process, so it will silt up again. And by removing that silt, you're removing a lot of natural, nutrients and whatever. So you're going to have to keep doing it, and it's a very expensive process. So that is one of the key arguments why it's not seen as the answer. I guess again, it's about the philosophy of, the old philosophy was move the water on as quickly as possible, and the new philosophy is hold the water back. And obviously dredging is part of that old philosophy of move the water on as quickly as possible. It would be a whole lot better if that water never arrived in the rivers in Somerset, but was kept back in the hills. And some of the response to the 2013-2014 Somerset floods has been projects that have paid farmers to hold the water back in the hills, which I think will become more frequent after Brexit if what Gove was promising gets its way. So, in a sense, it's something that I'm not generally a great fan of Brexit, but in this respect, I think Brexit may lead us to do something which is more ahead of its time than the European Union would have allowed. And, to be paying farmers to keep water back, I think would be a really useful thing, particularly in landscapes like Somerset, which are not agriculturally the most productive. And the other thing to say perhaps is that in Somerset, in the past, the natural regime was that the water would overflow the rivers, go onto the landscape and dump a lot of silt on the landscape. And through the way we've managed the rivers in Somerset since the 70s, we've not been allowing that. So all the silt has been stuck in the river rather than being able to go onto the landscape, and we've had to use artificial fertilizers instead. So I think there's perhaps a need to explore whether we can do a little bit more of that natural flooding and using trying to move towards different ways of farming that are more in line with the rhythms of the river, rather than trying to kind of control the river in a false way. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. I've got another question and then I've got a comment. So I'll do the question first. This is from A. Sonny. I'm an architect new to planning. Please may I ask which resources you would recommend looking at to learn more? Is there a good detailed reference resource as well? And he says, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, they say, thank you very much for a really interesting talk.
Oh, well, that's very nice.
That's nice, isn't it? So if there's any resource that we can, you can recommend.
I mean, it's an interesting question because I don't think anyone has actually. Yeah, no, okay. So I'll plug my own book to start off with. So I wrote a book called Reconnecting People with Water from 2017. And it kind of explores a lot of these issues around the changing relationships between people and water over time. And there's a chapter on flooding, but there's also chapters on water supply and things like that. So although it's not centrally about planners and architects' experiences, it gives you some of this context. So that could be really interesting. There's also a book which I referenced in an early slide, the one with the definitions in it. So I think it's in the notes on this one that, of course, I can't see. Will the slides be made available to people, Becky?
As far as I'm aware, I don't know the answer to that. I think this is being recorded, so I'm presuming that if this is recorded, we can do it that way. So yeah.
Okay. So so Ian White wrote a book called Water in the City, from which I quoted the flood directive here. And if you're able to see the notes, it has the reference there. There we go, 2010, it says in my title. And he's Ian spelled I-A-I-N. And that's quite a good book too. And it's sort of something, it's got the word resilience, water, city. There's some combination of words like that in there, which I think is also quite a useful book. So my book, Reconnecting People and Water, 2017, and Ian's book from 2010 are potentially useful resources. But it's an interesting question. And I suppose one of my thoughts is that on the whole, planners probably don't have time to read books that often nowadays. So I wonder, I mean, I'm interested in your comments and your thoughts about what's the best way to keep such conversations going. Do we need to do some CPD on water and flood risk management? Would that be a useful thing to think about? So I'm very happy to hear your ideas and thoughts on that.
So that also seamlessly leads me into the comment that we received. So this is from Jane Shepherd, and she said she totally agrees with the need to work closely together. My experience is that systematical reduction in funding available to the EA has meant and then watering down of the advice through no fault of their own, through standard advice to planning office who become responsible for flooding with little knowledge or expertise. Hang on, it keeps going just a minute. I have to scroll down. Although I was lucky enough to learn about hydrology through my degree in geography, I learned nothing about flooding related to planning. And if this is still the same, planners are not equipped to deal with this. Standard advice. This needs to be more fun. There needs to be more funding and respect given to the experts at the EA. They know what they are talking about, and our planners need more training to deal with it. So that's the strength of feeling that I don't necessarily think anybody would disagree with in terms of the need for more training. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly in favour of more training, more jobs for me. But no, I mean, I think the problem is, I suppose, that I think planners are asked to know about everything. They're asked to be able to speak on, issues about transgender and flooding and city centre regeneration and economic development, and millions of different things. And obviously you can't be an expert in everything. You need to be able to draw on other experts and have access to them, and to have enough knowledge of each area to be able to have an intelligent conversation. I think that's what we can teach. So it sounds like from that comment, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name, that that perhaps there might be a demand for CPD related to, perhaps we could make it a bit broader and talk about water management and the institutions of water management for planners. And perhaps I should have a chat with the RTPI about whether and how we could look at building that together. I mean, particularly in the current context where we've all learnt to do things online, suddenly geography isn't such a barrier. We don't have to get everybody to Sheffield once a month or something. So there is space for CPD now in a way perhaps there didn't used to be.
Very much so. Okay, right, I have the last question because I'm conscious of time. So, to keep up with the, this is from Faiza McKay. To keep up with the demand for regrowth, as in population, employment and housing, many cities are planning for flood resilient uses in the urban area. In the UK, what are the main challenges being experienced balancing regrowth and environmental protection? For example, Hull that is declining but also needs flood resilience.
Well, I mean, I think the questioner has obviously a lot of knowledge of this area as well. I guess there's a central challenge that these things cost. It's all very well if you're developing in the Thames Valley, down in an area where there's been a huge demand for housing and there's a lot of, and land values are high. You can require a lot of your developers in terms of flood resilience and in terms of flood defence of the site and so on. Or you can, ask for a neighbouring area to be given up or turned into a lake or something. You can do all sorts of things in terms of what you ask your developers. It's much more challenging in an area where there is, much more pressure to bring housing and development in, but not the finance to necessarily deliver the profits developers need. I think a key thing here might be that, we're trying to, part of our current project is working with some developers in an alternative design for a housing site in Hull. So we're trying to look at how could you make the site really flood resilient, but deliver the same development profit from it. So it's not me that's leading that, it's a colleague who works very closely with developers and has good understanding of development and finance side of things, and alongside our kind of flood resilient designers. Because I think that there might be a process of upfront planning for flood risk, where you can actually make sites really beautiful and really enhance housing development through the way you plan them, through basically clever planning, clever site design, which isn't necessarily always used at the moment. The standard approach to a housing development in the UK would be mostly that you design your site and then you retrofit or you retro plan the drainage. You don't build it before you put the drainage in, but you only plan the drainage after you've planned where the properties are going and where the gardens are going and where the roads are going. Now, if you're going to have more sustainable drainage, you need to do that the other way around. You need to start thinking about the drainage up front and have the design of drainage integrated into the kind of design of the site and the choosing where the properties go. And you might be looking at having small wetlands or ponds in different people's private gardens and things like that. So you might be looking at ways to design the site which both deliver the flood resilience but don't take away from the value, and that would be clever. So just coming back to the question, what are the key challenges? I suppose coordination is a key challenge, money is a key challenge, and perhaps learning, because I think a lot of what happens, it's easy to just blame legislation and money, and of course those things do have a role. And the government are, for example, in the process of changing their non-statutory sustainable drainage guidance to define sustainable drainage in a much more creative way than they do at the moment. At the moment, it's just about comparison of flows. But over and above those legislative changes that I think are important, I think there are key challenges about imagination and about knowledge and kind of just doing things in a different way. And that if we can start to show things that can be done differently, there's a lot that could be done. A little bit like coronavirus, for years, teaching staff in universities have been saying, oh, we couldn't possibly teach online, it wouldn't be the same. And of course, it's not the same. But there are opportunities it's brought as well as lots of restrictions. And I don't think we'll ever go back completely to teaching the way we used to teach. So in the same way, I think people could actually, there's a lot of changes people could make in the way they develop, and let's hope they do.
Well, that is a perfect point to end on. So I'd just like to thank Liz for her time this afternoon, and it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. If there's any questions we haven't got to, we'll try our best to answer them outside of the meeting. And yeah, if there's any more comments that you want to send through to Liz with the questions that you've asked, if you just go through our coordinator, and we'll do our best to try. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you for attending, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Becky.
Bye.
See you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.